welcome to Chapter 2, The Dynamic Environment of International Trade. The learning objectives for this chapter are the following. The basis for the reestablishment of the world trade after World War II, the importance of the balance of payment figures to a country's economy, the effects of protectionism on world trade, and the several types of trade barriers. The provisions of the Omnibus Trade and Competitiveness Act, the importance of the GATT and the World Trade Organization, the emergence of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank Group. Now, let's start with the chapter. Tariffs and non-tariff barriers. Until recently, countries used them consistently, but their use has been largely reduced due to efforts from different organizations, etc. However, we're seeing that nationalistic leaders are threatening these efforts. With their use, some countries attempt to control trade for their own advantage. As competition increases, so does the tendency towards protectionism. However, we see that global trade benefits everyone by providing more business opportunities for marketers and also by providing a wider selection of goods and services for consumers. Here in Exhibit 2.1, we can see the top 10 2017 U.S. trading partners with China leading the list. We export $130 billion to China, import $505 billion into the U.S., and have a difference or trading deficit of $375 billion. However, we should not look at this number just for their face value, as most electronics imports from China include parts made in other countries. For example, let's look at the 2017 Apple imports from China. With $16 billion approximately in iPhones. Here in Exhibit 2.2, we can see that only 3.6% of the components and labor that go into an iPhone come from China, and the rest come from other countries, including 6%. Before we continue, here are some images to illustrate the current trade deficit. On the left, we see the US tractors ready to be exported, and on the right, we have the South Korean cars ready to be imported. The number of tractors are definitely surpassed by the number of South Korean cars. Now, let's look at some events during the 20th century. We had the World War I that led to an economic depression and high tariff walls. Then we had the World War II and the United States aiming to spread capitalism. Also, as economies grew, new markets were created. Then, in order to prevent situations similar to the World War I, the GATT, or the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, was passed. This agreement had the goal to reduce tariffs and trade barriers. We also had the emergence of the U.S. multinational corporations, as U.S. companies branched out to foreign economies. At this time, there were many opportunities because economies grew after World War II. And by the late 60s, Europe and Latin America saw U.S. dominance as threatening, and therefore established limits on U.S. investments in their territories. The result was that the economic power was more evenly distributed. Let's look at the balance of merchandise trade. The role of the U.S. in global trade has evolved through time. We had a favorable balance until 1979, but since then, a constant trade deficit has been the norm. In the 1980s, many important questions were raised. For example, how should we compete in foreign markets? Were other countries fair with their international trade policies? Then, in the 1990s, we saw many changes in world trade. We had the creation of organizations such as NAFTA, the European Union, the AFTA, and the APEC. Then power shifted to more countries. There were new market opportunities. Countries with power invested in other countries. Companies expanded their global reach. It is important to note that in international trade, financial transactions occur with each trade. Money is constantly flowing in and out of the country, and it is important to keep track of these transactions. In the US, we have the balance of payments statement. Here we record all financial transactions with other countries. Credits and debits must offset each other, and it is a double entry bookkeeping system. This statement has three main accounts: current account, capital account, and reserves account. So, why is the balance of payments important? Because high merchandise trade deficit yields to an imbalance. This imbalance lowers the value of the US currency, the purchasing power, and the demand for imports. However, US products become cheaper for foreign buyers and exports increase. In Exhibit 2.5, the bar chart shows the United States current account balance in terms of a percent of its GDP from 1971 to 2017. Protectionism. It refers to countries that try to protect their own markets by repelling unwanted foreign investments and imports. They use barriers for protection, such as tariffs, quotas, exchange barriers. Here are the arguments for protectionism: protection of an infant industry, protection of the home market, the need to keep money at home, the encouragement of the accumulation of capital, to maintain certain standard of living and real wages, the conservation of natural resources, the industrialization of a low-wage nation, the maintenance of employment, the reduction of unemployment, national defense, enhancement of business size, and retaliation and bargaining. However, protectionism can be harmful because it contributes to a country's industrial inefficiency. It detracts from a nation's adjustment to the world situation, and tariffs cost consumers more money, who will be less likely to purchase, which in turn hurts the economy. Free trade is typically beneficial. As more people are willing to purchase, there is higher purchasing power for the average consumer, there is increased income for all involved, and more job opportunities. Here, in Exhibit 2.6, we can see the growth of consumer purchasing power from 1990 through 2016 for the US, Canada, Mexico, and China. And especially China is the one that shows a steep curve going up. Trade barriers. Governments establish tariff and non-tariff barriers against foreign imports and businesses. These include quotas, boycotts, monetary barriers, and market barriers. The reason for barriers are to develop new domestic industries or to protect current domestic industries. Tariff barriers tend to increase pressures on inflation, privilege on special interests, government control, and political considerations in economic affairs. The number of tariffs resulting from countries impacted by your country's tariffs, or which is also called reciprocity. Tariff barriers tend to weaken balance of payment positions, supply and demand patterns, international relations, trade wars. Tariff barriers tend to restrict manufacturer supply sources, choices available to consumers. Here is a list of non-tariff barriers: quotas and import licenses, voluntary export restraints, boycotts and embargoes, monetary barriers, standards, anti-dumping penalties, domestic subsidies, and economic stimuli. A voluntary export restraint, or VER, is voluntary because the exporting country defines the limits. However, it is generally done under the threat of stiffer quotas and tariffs being established by the importing country if a VER is not followed. Now, let's look at what help ease trade restrictions. We have the Omnibus Trade and Competitiveness Act, which is a U.S. policy that was established in 1988. It aimed to help U.S. businesses become more successful in world markets, correct perceived injustices in trade policies, as many countries were allowed to trade freely with U.S., but they did not reciprocate. It covers three main areas for improving U.S. trade: market access, export expansion, and import relief. Then we have the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or the GATT, which is a worldwide agreement signed after World War II, and it has three main provisions. Trade shall be conducted on a non-discriminatory basis. Protection shall be afforded for domestic industries through custom tariffs, not through commercial measures such as import quotas. Consultation shall be the primary method used to solve global trade problems. The GATT has had 8 rounds of negotiations since its creation, with the creation of the World Trade Organization during the Uruguay round. The World Trade Organization is the expansion of the GATT structure into an standalone institution. It has 164 members that must participate and adhere to its rules. It has a panel of experts that hears and resolves disputes on a continuous discussion and not just during rounds. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank Group. These are two global institutions that help nations become and remain economically viable. The International Monetary Fund, or IMF, has 188 members, and its goals are to stabilize foreign exchange rates and to establish freely convertible currency. They are credited with developing the Special Drawing Rights, or SDRs, which is an artificial currency instrument that averages some major currencies. The World Bank Group. Its goals are to reduce poverty and improve living standards, to promote sustainable growth and investment in people. It is made up of 5 institutions with separate objectives. These provide loans, technical assistance, and policy guidance to help developing nations achieve their goals. Beginning in 1999, we had some anti-capitalist protests. People were fighting against the unintended consequences of global trade, such as harm to the environment, worker exploitation and job loss, cultural extinction, increased oil prices, etc. There were some violent protests, terrorism, and some non-violent ones, which enacted policy change. Here are some images of violent and peaceful protests.